All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome to you all. I'm sure more will be joining us. This is our June conversations with Capitol Hill United Ministries. And we're continuing our theme of reclaiming. And it's our dedication to our language, reclaiming meaning and discussion around important issues of today, such as science and the environment and race and politics and caring for those who are marginalized. I think you all know me, Deanna Flahive, Director of Capitol Hill United Ministries and the Women's Homelessness Initiative, which we hope will be reopened in the late fall. We're still working on that. Today should be a dynamic conversation and sharing, since we have a dynamic woman leading us today, and I'll introduce her in a bit. But first, another wonderful woman, Sonia Yeager Meeks, who's our Zoom guru. And Sonia, would you like to say anything about what we're doing in terms of Zooming today?
Sure, I think it'll be very straightforward. After Michelle gives her presentation, there'll be a time for a Q&A, and at that point you can either put it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself and ask your question of Michelle.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue at hand today is reclaiming the public square, civility and political conversations. And I know none of us are having an issue right now with any of those things. We're just fine with the way things are going. So we are fortunate this morning to have Michelle Ferrigno Warren. She's a dynamic woman whose heart is open to the woundedness of our community. She has great courage. Her courage is strong, as she's dedicated her life as a champion of critical issues of the day, such as immigration and conversation. And I say this with great respect, Michelle. She's someone who's a bit off. And I say that because she jumped into the political vortex and ran for governor of Colorado. And she can talk a little bit about that later. And there's also much more. She's an educator, an author, a teacher, a wife, a mother, one of the founders of ODM, Open Door Ministries. And I'm really excited that the Taveo House, which I don't know if you want to say anything about, Michelle, in a little bit, is open, and it'll be housing women who are homeless. So thank you, Michelle, for taking the time to talk with us on the issue today. And it's how do we manage the breach, the frustration, the growing divisiveness in our dialogue? We turn it over to you. Just a simple little question. Go for it.
Thank you, Deanna. It is so good to be among, and if it is okay, I would like to call you friends. It's really great to be with friends. I have not been as local in the last 10 years, but have always appreciated Capitol Hill United Ministries. And back when I was doing work at Open Door Ministries, was a little bit connected. Sometimes when you're starting an organization, you want to partner with everybody, but you can't partner if you've got nothing to build to partner with. So I do know that I have known of CHUM and have interacted very, very limited, but many years ago. And it's a privilege to be with you all today. So thank you for the invitation. And as Deanna and I were talking, I will say that she was asking me some questions, and we together came up with the title and what we were going to talk about, because we do need people who are willing to see the humanity in other people, to put politics aside, and to really move together towards things that they can agree on. So I have never thought that I'm a national community organizer and advocate. That was not my plan. I left college and took my math degree and was a 7th grade middle school teacher, and no making noises or funny faces around 7th graders. I loved teaching, and I loved teaching 7th graders. What made my story a little unique is because I'm from Colorado, I actually was neighbors with Carl Mecklenburg from the Broncos, and I lived with a lot of oil execs, presidents, and vice presidents of Exxon. My dad actually was the president and CEO of Stearns Catalytic, which is a Raytheon corporation. So I share a little bit of my background just so that you know that I came from a really privileged background. And so when I chose to live and move into the community that I was going to teach, it was a really big learning curve. I moved into Section 8 housing with African American families, and I taught at the local middle school in 7th grade. And while I was the one with the title teacher, truly I was definitely the student and the student of the community. And that is what I often, or I will want to strive to be, as a student of my community, to be in a listening posture, and then together for us to move toward what I often will refer to, and I steal it from Lila Watson, a shared liberation. So I didn't mean to get political. From my background and my faith background, I have both Catholic and evangelical roots. And I learned pretty quick, I don't know when, but I just knew that if you wanted to get into trouble, you would talk about politics. And if you talked about politics outside of the Republican Party and the moral majority, you were on your way to hell. I mean, those were not the exact words, but that was pretty much the sentiment. So I will just say this: I did not run for governor. I ran for U.S. Senate.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem. I don't feel qualified to run for governor, but have worked with Congress so many years. I found it more frustrating to stand on the sidelines during the 2020 election than it was to just jump in. And there's a lot of reasons that I jumped in. Some of it was I wanted to represent the needs of my community, but two, I wanted to see a woman senator. It was the 100-year anniversary of women's suffrage, and I wanted representation. I was like, my reproductive rights are important, my paycheck zeros are important, but at the end of the day, I want to see me in office here in Colorado. So I just want to clarify that. But yes, a little bit of my background came up from Dallas. My husband and I joined Open Door Fellowship and some of the work they wanted to do on Marianne Street. And we're like, yeah, we think we can start, which is now the Kaya House, but start a house for homeless teen girls. And we did. And David and I learned we had skills that we didn't know we ever had in fundraising and nonprofit community development. He had a THM, a master's in theology from Dallas Seminary, which is super, super conservative. And I had a math and music degree. So sure, of course, we would start a house. We were 25. We were too dumb to know that we probably shouldn't have started it, but we did. And we learned along the way. And the next year, started Open Door Ministries. We just felt like it wasn't okay to have an independent little house alongside a church, but that we really needed to create more stability and community work. And so we started the community development organization. And I'm pretty sure, and we were 25 and 26 when we started Open Door Ministries. So if that gives you an idea of just a little bit of the crazy. So if you think I'm one off because I ran, or, it's always been that way. We see needs and we jump in. And honestly, friends, isn't that what happens when you live at the front line of pain and injustice and lack of barriers? You can't hold back, especially as a person of faith. I'm a person of Christian faith, and I'm just like, Jesus told me to, go so bold as love my enemies. But he defined love in the story of the Good Samaritan, which is get off your own agenda when you see pain and brokenness and do everything you can to not only help that individual in that moment, to really make sure that they're healed and able to move forward in life. And so that was really kind of our story. So we were 25 and 26. We're like, yeah, we think this is how we should be doing it. And Open Door Fellowship was probably just desperate enough to say, yeah, why don't you give it a whirl? And, I don't know what they thought or what we thought, but every year we just invested a little bit more and poured out our life as a drink offering and just said whatever we need to do to walk alongside our neighbors. So after being a teacher and starting a nonprofit and trying to buy a house in Denver during gentrification, the beginnings of gentrification and putting kids in schools, and we live actually at Federal and Alameda, and 80219 is a very poor community, and raised our kids in the local public schools. My awareness to individual and social injustices really began to explode. And that's important for me to share in a little bit of my story, because I started by telling you a little bit of where I came from. My parents live on the 18th hole of the Douglas County Highlands Ranch golf course. So I didn't reject my background, but I've definitely expanded beyond it. And so when I began to do work and realize, the education system has issues, the first thing I ever marched for was in 2002 for No on 31, when there was this ballot initiative, basically an amendment that we would change that English was the only thing that could be taught to kids who were ESL students. And so it was the very first thing I ever did in 2002. And I began to navigate more into community organizing because our community needed some collective voice. And I didn't really care I did care. I'm going to be honest, that's not true. At that time, I did care, but I could not help myself. I cared that I was getting political, but I kept getting closer and closer to the political line because we had huge systemic barriers. And I share some of this because when Deanna was asking me, how do we build bridges to people that came from my background, you have to understand the huge barrier it is for people from my upbringing to even begin to navigate into political pieces. And when you come from a privileged background, the system works for you. I wrote a book, it's been 5 years now, and the very first sentence in that book is this: if you wake up in the morning and the system works for you, you think it's a good system. And that's what was happening. I had brought up in a system that worked for me, and it worked for people like me. And from that point of privilege, there was this cast, whether it was explicit or not, that if people would just do it our way, then maybe we all could be okay. And so the deconstructing of the way I thought only happened because I was living in a community, I was sharing the similar struggles, and my eyes were being open to a system that I thought was inherently good, was actually not good. That there were limitations, the systemic barriers, that even as good as programming like Tebeo House will be, it's not the sum total of the solution. That individual acts of mercy and response to a problem are actually not seeking justice or doing justice. That we need to walk a little bit farther up that proverbial hill to see why people are being thrown into that river, that we have to pull drowning people out of a river downstream. But we have to ask, not at the end of the day, but during the day, in the heat of the day, when we're super busy, when we're walking alongside places like a Jericho Road, and we're really on a rush, like a Levite and a priest would be, and we see a half-dead, beaten up person on that side of the road, that we say, wait a second. Even in the middle of the day, in the middle of my agenda, I have to be willing to walk up the road and see what's throwing people in. And that's when we begin to really look at the systemic, beyond the individual and social justice issues, but really the systemic justice issues. Well, I was young and dumb, and so was David, and we did the best we could with the skills that we had, and we were trying to learn along the way. But as I began to realize I was going to navigate into systemic injustice, I knew I was way in over my head. Like, we had learned probably, we were always learning, but we knew nothing about starting a 501c3. So we learned. We knew nothing about fundraising. So we gave it a whirl. All of the things that we needed to do to make Open Door Ministries successful. And these idealistic young, late 20s now people, we're just doing it. But when I began to realize that there were public policies, that there were barriers that were literally intended and created to keep people out, that I was going to have to get smarter. And I remember a conversation. So we have 3 kids. Now they're 25, 23, and 19. But when our youngest was 2, we were in DC, which is a place that I'm there all the time now, but I hadn't been in years. And when you're in DC, you begin to realize that you're a part of something bigger. I don't know if that's how you all feel or if you've ever been to DC, but you can kind of feel the power and the history and even the deterioration of our public sector right now. Just, there's a lot of emotion. So I remember us talking a lot about those systems. And I remember telling David, and it's probably because I had just given birth to 3 children in 5 years and built an organization. And I said to him, I was just like, the 2 of us, somebody needs to be a lawyer here. This is ridiculous. Like, we don't know anything. And we can't really help people with the systems that are at play. I remember him looking at me and saying, Michelle, I like my job. This is what Dave said to me. He goes, I like my job. He's like, don't live your dreams through me. You go be a lawyer. I thought, well, maybe I should. Maybe that 2-year-old will grow up to be a 3-year-old, and maybe I can go to night school, because working full time and having 3 kids and living in the city and trying to find parking with a car seat and a stroll, it was just crazy. But I thought, well, that's probably true. And so that put me on a journey to realize I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to understand public policy. I wanted to understand stakeholder collaboration. And that's what I focused on, because I was still 30. I was now 30. Now I'm naive enough to believe that if we just put the right people together and we really listen to the voices of what's happening in our communities, that the windows will open and public policy will bring forth and no one will be homeless. Let me just say, I love young people. I loved being a young person. After night school and doing some community organizing and still working for Open Door and doing all those things that mothers do, et cetera, and daughters and sisters and all the roles that I was playing in night school, I began to realize that there was something I knew literally nothing about. And that's getting to that line. So when I told people that we're funding Open Door Ministries, by the way, Open Door Ministries funders aren't in love with the fact that we work on systemic injustice, and we've lost a lot of money every time either David or I do something that says something, about support for immigrants, some of those really big polarizing issues that we've taken a lot of bold steps on. We have lost money, but we, first of all, don't care. And second of all, we've gained, other things, and the tent has gotten bigger. So I say that because as I got closer and closer, people were okay with me getting smarter in public policy. They were okay with some of the talking I was getting in there, pushing back a little bit on the idea of using the word justice. I remember there's an evangelical church that is actually not that old, probably less than 10 years old in the city, one of those new church plants from evangelical roots. And I was going toe to toe with one of their pastors, probably on the issue of immigration, who knows. But what ended up disseminating was the word justice. And he's like, well, I don't even use the word justice from the pulpit because it's a political word. I'm not a big yeller, but I could feel the passion coming from my belly. I was so offended. I'm like, justice isn't a political word. And being an evangelical, having evangelical roots, talking to an evangelical, it's a biblical word. And then I proceeded to educate him on the theology of mishpat and justice, and basically saying what we kind of are talking about today. Don't allow the politics of the day to rob the truth of your faith and what literally sits at the foundations of God's throne, righteousness and justice. That's foolishness. So as I got closer and closer, I was starting to have more and more of these types of conversations and realizing I needed to take sort of the under the water. I needed to come up for air on the other side, hopefully not drown in the process, because that's why you don't want to duck under, because you think you might not come up. I needed to learn about politics, that there was nothing safe about radically or just loving your neighbor as yourself. We don't even have to say the word radical loving. Loving is a radical act. As a person from Christian faith, the Greek word of agape all has to do with the emptying of themselves of rights, of privileges, and literally just pouring yourself out in sacrifice. And so I needed to not have any well, I'll love my neighbor until it gets too political, because that's where I was coming. I'm like, you know what? There is no line that I'm not going to cross to love my neighbor as myself. If my kids were dying, if I was separated with them because of status, I mean, all of the different things that I was learning as a neighbor and as a person working alongside the community at Open Door and then over here at Federal and Alameda, just realized I would fight like hell for my family. And I say that you're my friends and you're my family, but will I fight like hell even when it costs me everything? And that has been the journey that I've been on the last 15 years. And I will say this, of course I'm going to fight like hell. I'm going to do absolutely everything that I possibly can. I'm not a natural rule-breaking person. I actually love rules. I think they're super fun and they're great, because I believe if we just had the right rules, we could all live at peace with one another, but so for me I'm not going to go poke angry bears, but I also am incredibly principled and realize that if we have to poke angry bears to get good things, then I'm just going to have to grow some courage. And that was another thing that I really learned in my journey, which was courage is not the absence of fear. It's living your convictions in the face of it. And over, when you practice courage over and over again, you get brave. And so I'm not going to go into the details of all of the things that have happened, but for the last 15 years, almost 15 years, I've been working actually nationally, building campaigns for issues like immigration and mass incarceration, education equity, payday lending, family medical leave insurance, et cetera, et cetera. I could keep talking, but you'll probably say, you know what? That's just really an expression of loving her exact neighbor. Now, we know loving neighbors isn't supposed to be this Western who lives on either side of you. It's whoever comes in front of your path that you're wanting to see. How does the light and goodness of love really reach out and extend to a person in need? In order for me to talk about politics and to talk about civility, I felt like you should probably know a bit of my background. I also inserted some parts of my story because I want, in Deanna's questioning, trying to understand this whole group of faith that is denying science and seems like it doesn't care about the environment. It's like happy to have children suffer from that. I mean, you're right. That is totally offensive to me as well. But what I have noticed and learned is that fear of rejection, fear of losing funding, fear of losing congregants keeps people very, very quiet. And what I have been doing is building coalitions, mostly of senior pastors. That was really hard for me. I would rather hang out with my Latino community or my African-American friends and actually have to go talk to white megachurch pastors from an evangelical denomination. I hate that. But I need to humble myself and be willing to love my people. And so that is often what I will do, is talk to even people like Tom Tancredo, just to continue to find each other's humanity. Because that's what we have lost. I shouldn't even say we've lost it. I don't really know too many paradigms that we've had civility. Several of you seem a little bit more seasoned than me. And so maybe there is a time that you can remember that the country agreed and worked together. But the very nature of bringing your personal convictions to a public place and working it out in debate, to me, that is how it has always been done. But we are in dangerous territory right now, probably like we've been in other times, because we refuse to see the humanity in our enemy. And the enemies are so vast. It's not just who doesn't agree with me politically. Instead of saying, well, I used to go to dinner with them, or I go to dinner with them, we just don't agree, and we kind of avoid the conversation. Or when we do, it gets dicey. So now, like, I won't even talk to that person. I've kind of canceled them out of my life. That's the whole cancel culture piece. So we see that just in relationships, community relationships. We've seen churches, breaking congregations. That happens within, the fabric of congregations. I was just on the Western Slope doing immigration presentations, and, a group of immigrants some DACA kids were telling me about the school they taught in, and that every day in this dual language school out on the Western Slope, this one dad drops off his son with a Confederate and a Trump flag. And this conversation, and it's heinous. You've got people who are undocumented dropping off their kids, and then you've got what looks like a bully. And as I listened to the conversation, I really was empathizing, but I also didn't want to miss the opportunity to say, I wonder what it's like to be that son. Can we see the humanity of other people? And if we as faith leaders who have our faith informs our response, or we say that it informs our response, we can't hold hate in our heart. We can't accept behavior and things, but we can't hold hate in our heart. We have to believe that there's something on the other side that I reach to. I was telling Deanna, when I frame issues like immigration, and immigration is probably the most polarizing topic that I have had to deal with. And I've dealt with it for a really long time, and I'm not going anywhere. And it invokes a lot of fear. And there's brain chemistry reasons for that. And there's things that we can try to do to help. But I usually tell faith leaders, I was at the Unitarian Universalist Church on Sunday, and I tell, Southern Baptist pastors, everybody in between, pretty much the same thing. Your theology, immigration, when I talk you only are talking to me about political talking points. You know a little bit of the politics, usually very little, but you know a little bit of the politics, and you seem very right. And that's all you want to talk about. I'm an immigration policy expert. I advise Hickenlooper, I advise Gardner, I advise, people from both sides of the aisle. Senate Judiciary Committee is my niche. They deal with all immigration stuff. So I can pretty much, talk to you about anything on immigration policy. And when I try to have conversations, all you want to do is talk about politics. And usually, and I tell people, and I'm telling you this, that is a very low level conversation, especially as leaders of faith who are supposed to be starting at the theology. What do you even think of God or the higher being? And how does it inform your anthropology? What is your view of people? Do you see people as inferior and superior? Almost nobody wants to be called a supremacist. White superiority, white privilege, white supremacy. That's so offensive. Well, really, where is your anthropology? Do you think men are better than women? Do you think people of color are on a lower social hierarchy? Would you even take time to listen to what critical race theory is all about? Are you so offended that you even shut down? So what is your anthropology? How does your theology inform your anthropology? And then after you go from anthropology, and you need to do, I tell people, you need to do a lot of internal work. I have to do the internal work too. Working with white racial identity, working with, just like I said, a lot of the views of people. You've got to do the work on your anthropology, not just of how you view yourself, but how you view men and women and human beings. And then once you move from your theology to anthropology, then you pick up, and then we can talk about sociology. How in the world are we all going to get along with one another? And it's in that sociology that we create things like public policy. Public policy that turns into laws that I'm going to jump and just look up Kohlberg's, stages of moral development at some other time. But for those of you who might know about that, our public policy in the United States writes as a contract. It doesn't go all the way up to it is justice. It is this rigid thing. It is about as the closest, hopefully proximate justice we can get. And when we find out there's unintended consequences, and that this whole utilitarian model that we're trying to do the most amount of good with this particular sociological public policy response, we recognize that people have lost out. And so we need to come back to the table and rework on the contract. So how does our sociology inform our public policy? How do we really think? And how do we challenge some of that? Do we believe homeless people deserve homes? Do we believe healthcare is a basic human right? Do we believe that people who've come here without status and to save their family from poverty and have been here for 25 years, do we believe that they deserve a visa? Do we want to continue to perpetuate a society that says we want your work, but we just don't want you? Let's be honest. And if we truly want justice, and if we truly want really good things, then we sit at the table and we hash it out, and then we play politics. But we're sobered. We're sobered because politics is a game. It's a game that we play to get what we need to get done. We begin to learn how to play politics. I don't know anybody who doesn't know how to play it at some level. At around 3, when we realize, listen, if I want this, I know which parent I should talk to. In school, I know when I can get away with certain things. We are gamers. We have a shrewdness about us to know how to get things done. And when it's an individual politics, have mercy on our relationships, our marriages, our families. But the things that we're talking about is societal, public policy politics. We're playing with the very lives of people, and the stakes are very, very high. And we in the faith community need to make sure that we never allow the wave to pull us back, so that, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, we are tools of the state. We are the moral conscience of the state. And sometimes we don't even get along with each other in our own congregations, in our own denominations, much less Muslim, Jew, Catholic, Christian. in each one of those, there's, groups that have broken out. And it is imperative for us to recognize that there's something bigger than our agreeing with how we interpret our theology, but that we need to pick it up at anthropology. And we need to ensure that we are a moral conscience. Sometimes it is just so hard to sit at a table with somebody you don't agree with. But we're never going to get the justice we seek. We're never going to get the civility we seek if we don't at least show up. And so one, we have to just humble ourselves to show up with people that we don't agree with. Not because we're going to compromise what we think, but because we're going to fully show up. For me, it's hard for me to show up. It's hard for me not to hold hate and contempt for the other. But as a person of faith who has committed to loving my enemies and loving my neighbor as myself, as those are supposed to define who I am, then I need to do that bigger work. I need to desperately find the imago Dei, even in somebody as repulsive as Trump. Because if I hold hate in my heart and think I'm better than him and think I'm more right, and Rita, I don't agree with this guy at all. I can't. I don't want to sit at the table. It's very hard. I got invited to the White House and somebody said, "Are you sure you're going to go?" And I'm like, I have to. I didn't actually get the invitation. I'm too polarizing and too difficult for Republicans. So they say stuff like that, but then they can't vet me. So anyway, I have to be willing to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to become like him. And so I just want us to at least be honest to say that if we desire civility in the public square, then we need to do the bigger work in our own hearts first, never compromising our principles or who we are and who we represent, but be willing to show up. Frederick Douglass, I think we all know who Frederick Douglass was. He joined the abolitionist movement. He was pretty much one of the main voices, and there's this accounting. I remember reading the story and kind of reading the quotes and just being sobered when I think about building bridges to people who don't agree with us, people who are literally on the other side of us, and they just infuriate me. So Frederick Douglass kept talking to the abolitionists, who are white, mostly religious people, caring very much about the abolitionist movement. He's like, if we're really going to get far, if we're really going to, get things over the barriers, we're going to have to make the table bigger to include slave owners. Frederick Douglass was the only person who actually was under a slave in this conversation, and he was promoting it. And the abolitionists were furious. There was no way they would ever let that table get big enough to include slaveholders. And it never did. But Frederick Douglass said, I would unite with anyone to do good and no one to do evil. And that has pretty much been a cornerstone of both loving my neighbor and my enemy, but also realizing I'll unite with anyone to do good and no one to do evil. And I think as a faith leader, I need to call out evil for evil. And I need to call out good for good. And I can't compromise those two things. But the only way to build bridges to back home to my evangelical and Catholic, both family members and friends, I have to decide to see their humanity. And I have to do everything I can to not change and compromise the person that I am become, but also not to think of myself as superior, more enlightened, smarter, you idiots. But just to realize that they haven't had the same opportunities. They haven't lived alongside immigrants. They haven't taught in public schools. They haven't, they've volunteered at Open Door Ministries, and I can't judge them. I just need to keep calling them, inviting them. Sometimes those of us who get funding dollars from more conservative communities and we steward more progressive communities, we can feel like we're in the middle and feel pulled. And I hear a lot of people say things like, well, I can see both sides. And I want to push against that too, because when you stay in the middle of an issue, people's lives are at stake. And when you stay in the middle, you actually give more credence to the oppression. Elie Wiesel I don't have the quote memorized. I wrote about it in my book. And so it was 5 years ago, so I don't remember, but I know he really fleshed out some strong words in this regard, and was very helpful for me, because I was writing it during the time that Trump was running for office. And I was just thinking about so much of my people, right? The people I came from that didn't really like him, but wouldn't vote against him because they just couldn't stand Hillary. It was hard. And I just kept thinking, how can you embolden an oppressor? Even if you don't come join me on the other side, how can you give air and credence to the hateful things he's spewing about my neighbors, about my friends, about the poor, about the vulnerable, about anyone in need of mercy? And Elie Wiesel really helped me get some language that when human lives are at stake, we have to choose the side of the vulnerable, and we have to do it boldly and without reservation. One of the worst things I think you probably could be labeled from my very conservative upbringing is to be labeled a liberal. I am well past being labeled a liberal and progressive and all of those little monikers that basically says you don't have to listen to her. You can disrespect her. You can stop, taking her calls. You don't have to give money to Open Door Ministries, even though I've been gone for years. When I chose to run for US Senate, of course, I shouldn't say of course, that's probably wrong. I am a Democrat and I chose to run for US Senate, and my phone did not get the hateful calls that my husband got. People pulled out of Open Door Ministries so fast. And so many people threatened his job and told him that they were going to work to get him fired because of his wife. A lot is at stake because you're like, well, Dave, I care about the poor. I care about the homeless. I want to do transitional housing. I just want to get the certification for DeVeo House. And my wife's running for office and everyone wants me out because she's a Democrat running for US Senate. So that's how people kind of play with, in my world, we call ourselves sort of the prophets, these prophetic voices that are, standing from the outside, looking at, in and sharing truth. And I remember, I don't know if you know Jeff Johnson, but he and I kind of occupy a very similar space years ago. And I just told him, I was like, they used to burn us and stone us. They don't kill us anymore. They just cut off our funding. But just to kind of know that that's the reality and that we have to ask ourselves, are we really in it? Will we do everything we can? And so anyway, I've given you a lot to probably think about. I'd like to stop actually and just take some questions. I want a long question time, not a question from you to me as though maybe I could, be some expert. I know a lot, but I am just like you. I'm learning and growing. And I think that this really needs more of a roundtable discussion of how can we really unite to do good. And how can we ensure that we don't compromise who we are and what we believe, but how can we invite people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, to at least some type of table so that we can start some of these conversations to see what we would even be able to unite around, because those tables barely exist. The idea that you could dream together, I was out in Grand Junction, I was talking to the pastor, Wendy, from the UUs, and she says to me, she said something about the Interfaith Network. I'm like, oh yeah, years ago I worked with the Interfaith Network. And she's like, oh no, that's the other Interfaith Network in Grand Junction. I'm like, you guys have two interfaith networks? She's like, yeah. And so she started listing, kind of sharing, and the two of us were just sort of lamenting. There's two interfaith networks in Grand Junction. Grand Junction ain't that big. And so like I said, even the idea that we could try to come together and see what does interfaith, and it doesn't, like I said, I don't think theology is going to be where you line up in, but anthropology is definitely where those conversations, and I think we should probably just forget trying on the, nobody needs that. We're uniting to do good. You be who you're going to be and see what we can bring to the table to try to do some good together. And I'm not saying that that's not happening, but, I'm just kind of using a little bit of just the language and things that I share. And honestly, the last 10 years, I haven't been as Colorado centric. I've worked for a national organization and have been doing this, this work nationally. and probably can give you insights on other states, but it is true, I haven't done quite as much grassroots work. I work with people like you who are in the grassroots and try to build consensus and coalitions of unlikely allies. I will say one thing, and this is a tactic. You might be sitting there thinking, this is never going to happen. Thank you very much. You've got some sweet stories, but after we're done, we're just going to say no way. You know, and that's okay. That's all right. I'm a guest that has declared you all friends. And so sometimes you can't pick something that is really about immigration. So a good example, Jen Piper and I have been friends for forever. And we worked on a lot of stuff at the state level and the county level. And she doesn't work so much nationally, although we both work on the issue of immigration, which is a big federal issue. And so we were trying to figure out, how can we get interfaith leaders and these newer evangelicals and Catholics to come to the table when they're just not used to working with people who don't agree with them, especially the evangelicals. The Catholics are a bit better on that, but you know, they just aren't even used to it. They've got so many sects in their evangelicalism, they won't come around. And so I was like, I have an idea. I was like, why don't we do a media training? We'll invite everybody to the table on media training around immigration. So then we never even really get into the policies and the politics. We'll just give them a skill, and pastors want to get better at stuff. So for whatever reason, I mean, the room was packed. And I think we saw at least probably 40% of the faith leaders were evangelicals. I had never gotten them in the room in an interfaith meeting since, before rather. No, since I have, but before, never. That was the very first thing I tried. And what I started with was, and it was during a time when immigration was just, everybody knew you should be talking about, but nobody knew how. And so we went around the room, why are you here? And so every single faith leader shared why they were here, and nobody's story was different. There wasn't more knowable stories than, the faith leaders. Everybody kind of came because they cared about the people that were impacted, the things that they had seen, people that they knew. And then the whole room exhaled about 2/3 through, like, oh, I guess these people aren't so bad. And then we just got smart. We learned how to write op-eds. We learned how to do, I did press releases. I mean, just all of this different media training. We broke up in groups of not people who necessarily agreed with each other, but broke up groups and did role playing. And it was a really great opportunity. And for a season, because that was the reason we gathered for that season, we worked really hard on that Gang of 8 bill and the messaging and this holistic conservative to progressive faith voice on the issue of immigration for the state of Colorado. I'll tell you, we made Cory Gardner kind of nervous. He said nice things about immigrants back then. So I'll go ahead and end with that and just say, Diana, can you and I maybe facilitate a Q&A, or even like, friends, do you want to just react? I mean, just some thoughts that you've had. I see there's 4 chats. I'm terrible at reading a chat and speaking, so I can go back and read them and see what they are, but I just would like to hear.
Sure. So let me, first of all, thank you for sharing your story. It's quite powerful. I mean, you and I have talked before, but this was really good in the angst. I mean, you shared your angst, your soul, your pain, and then the courage. And I think that's where many of us are, is we have a lot of angst and concern, and we may have had courage in trying to have conversation and then feel absolutely like we don't want to do this anymore because it goes nowhere. So I'm going to start with something, and then we're just going to open it up for people to ask other questions. And we have our list of questions that you have all seen, but I'm sure there'll be other discussion and people can just dive in. And I think that would be a good way to do it if people are in agreement, and feel free to get out of your mute and be part of this. So I'll start with this. You talk about theology informing anthropology, informing sociology, which informs our public policy. And I love that linear thinking. And the concern is I know that you can start at a different place, but the theology should be informing our anthropology. And the pain, I mean, I grew up Catholic, and the good part of what I grew up with on the East Coast was peace and justice. That's what I learned from my theology. But then I found the world just blew up. And in many parts of our theologies, whether it doesn't matter what, if you have a theology or you don't, the issue is it's not informing anthropology, because people who say they are believers do not feel that those people, and I just had a conversation with someone about those people are people that should be part of our sister and brotherhood. If they are less than, they will ruin our democracy. We don't, I mean, my experience, and this is my bias, I see who's ruining our democracy, and it's not the immigrant. So can you respond to that? And then people feel free to join in.
Yeah, there's quick answers and there's long answers. You know, fear is something that we really should talk about. This is 2021. So if you kind of butt up against, at least faith leaders, I mean, I'll talk about it. Everybody kind of knows it's not okay to be a racist, but they don't even know what racist behavior is. And so some of it is really helping people understand that. And that's why I kind of took a little bit of time on the anthropology, because I've had many conversations with people who think, oh, I love everyone and everybody, but then you start to drill down and it challenges the way they see people. And those are some of the really hard questions that really reveal you think you're better than people. You think you're superior. That's where the idea of supremacy, that's the idea of white supremacy. And some of those conversations, what I have that linear timeline because I tell people I won't even talk to you about politics until first we start about your anthropology. And so I usually use it as a sort of a hook to pull people back to a conversation that actually is really informed, because sometimes it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop and go on from anthropology to sociology, because people really do believe that they're better and that there should be exclusions. And I'm not talking about borders versus no border, but do you believe what is the role of people who have things versus the people who don't have things? And those are important conversations. Those are essential conversations. We have no business trying to work together on public policy if we can't even agree on our anthropology. So the reason I give that linear is it really helps show who wants to unite together to do good. Now, the fear piece is basic psychology. And this is why for over a decade and what I was doing with CIRC and still am doing, and I keep thinking, I'm so sick of doing this stuff. I'll be with Rotary in Douglas County next week, and just continuing to make the way through the path of people who are more naturally bent in a conservative lens to help them understand immigrants and our history and our system and the brokenness and the injustice. And sometimes it's just noise. I'm just tired, but I'm going to do it. I just think, oh, this is just a lot of work, but I do it because of basic psychology. The problem is that we have so much of fear-based news. Now, there's some really tragic things happening, like the high rise in Surfside, Florida. It was very tragic. And I would imagine a lot of people in that area are worried to be in their apartments. I mean, those are very tragic, very big, responses of emotion. But what happens a lot of time in media is we take that same emotion, we apply it to everything. And there's a lot of it's misplaced, and it really makes our amygdala exhausted. So the back of our brain, this is the basic psychology part, is when we hear things that make us afraid. Even people who are supportive of immigration reform, they hear, 60,000 more unaccompanied minors. And I get tons of calls. Just like, but can we really handle that? Because they're getting afraid. And they call me because they know I'm going to calm them down, because the amygdala doesn't know how to do anything except fight or flight. The only thing that can calm the amygdala down is actually the frontal lobe. That's our executive function. That's where good information lands. The news is not going to give you good information on immigration policy. And it's a lot of work to read a book. But we have so little good information on issues like immigration and payday lending. And so we hear a few political comments that either make us afraid or make us angry. And we have nothing. We have this big vacuum of information to calm us down. And so that's why I do so many workshops and presentations. So people have every right to ask questions. As rude as it sounds when it comes out, they have every right to ask, what part of the legal do people not understand? I think it's pretty offensive. But people need to be able to ask questions. It is not bad to ask a question. I think the way you say it sometimes is a little challenging, but people should have their answers, and you're not going to find it. You're not going to find it in the politics and in the news. Most of our legislators, I've met with tons of them, they don't know anything about immigration. They're just repeating talking points. And so, we have to make sure that we're getting good information out there. I mean, we have the line, you don't believe in science? And I want to say that all the time because I'm so upset. I have friends who are doctors and I'm like, are you a moron? That's what I really want to lead with. but I can't, I need to start by asking good questions. It's just a discipline. It's a discipline and it is hard work. And I'm just saying the long work of justice is exactly that.
So I'm going to break in for a moment. So what I'm hearing here is that let's not start with theology. I think people need to start with anthropology. I think that is because I am so personally pissed off at people who call themselves spiritual or Christian or whatever the heck, and they're just in a whole different realm in terms of social policies. So I think for me, the learning for today is just throw out the theology. That's your own personal thing, and go in right straight to the anthropology and ask those questions. So I really
agree, Deanna, but I will say I talk to pastors and I talk about theology because I have a lot of, I don't know if you know, like Paul, the Apostle Paul talks about how he was, circumcised on this day, and he puts all his credentials. I have got such evangelical credentials. I was a part of the Christian school movement. I went to Cedarville University, one of the most conservative, I have all of this language. And so it's, when I'm talking, I do a lot of theological redirection, but I know what I'm doing at that point. Like, right. Saying like, but I don't in an interfaith environment, I never even talk about that.
I think that's perfect. So let's go to a question that Maureen put up.
Yeah. And then after Maureen, Nora has her hand up.
Okay, great. Go for it, Sonia. Maureen, do you want to go for it, or do you want to say it, Maureen? Go ahead.
Actually, Maureen, I would love it if you asked it, because I can answer, but I want the context. I want to hear your voice. We're friends, right?
Well, I just struggle, you've referenced immigration policy a lot, and I really, feel strongly about we need to do something. It's just so unjust. And, I'm reminded again and again, but I just, I also don't know what that policy is. And it would be helpful to have some talking points or some thoughts that I could incorporate into my thinking.
Yeah, Maureen, I totally can identify with that. And I'm still learning, even though I know quite a bit. I think, first of all, the politics around immigration are always really almost catastrophic. The very first piece of federal immigration policy, like the United States, if you kind of came, you were in. Some states regulated certain things, but for the most part, the federal government had no opinion about immigrants until after, the last stake was put in the Transcontinental Railroad, after the gold rush. Then there was this presidential election where the people who were running were beginning to see that when they said nasty things about Chinese people, that they were actually going up in the proverbial poll. And that resulted in the very first, like, I'm going to be the savior of, of the fact that we have too many Chinese people here in the United States. And so the very first piece of federal legislation was in 1882, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the whole purpose of it was you can only come if you're not Chinese. So for my family, we came at like the turn of the century. I'm Italian American, and my mom has some Irish in her, and so it was late 1800s. But a lot of white Americans have a kind of a nostalgic idea of Ellis Island and there being a line, and why can't people just come the legal way? And honestly, until 1924. There was no illegal way to get here. So you had 1882, but 1924 was a really big piece of federal legislation. It was the very first time that the federal government was going to regulate who could come in and who couldn't come out on the Pacific and West Coast. Now the borders were open in Canada and in Mexico at the time, but they were going to regulate people coming in on ships. They had Angel Island in the West, they had Ellis Island, and between 1924 and 1965, everything sort of sat at a quota system. During that time, World War II is happening. People are moving. We've got political refugees and asylees. Lots of things are happening with world wars. After World War II, the United Nations rose up after the League of Nations was down. There's a lot of political things happening during that time that would regulate the movement of people. And globally, because of what had happened through Hitler and Stalin, and just there was millions of people displaced in the world during that time, they couldn't regulate policy. And so the United Nations created this global system called refugee and asylum, so that if there was any time in history that a person was leaving because of either religious or political persecution, they could go to a border and say, I want to seek asylum. So that was sort of the global narrative. At home, between 1924 and 1965, we started a quota system. A lot of times people will remember the quota. We have not done quotas since 1965, but before that we had a quota system, and 70% of the quota, 70% of the visas that were given, the quota would be filled from the UK, Germany, and Ireland, basically white people. And 30% was the rest of the world. Now, keep in mind, there was no regulation between the South and North. So Canada and Mexico didn't have to worry about quotas, but Africa and Asia, so, even like Italy for me, Greek, Eastern European Jewish people, we all had to share 30%. 1965, big things are happening. Civil rights, such an unjust system. We're going to rehaul it. And now we're going to get rid of the quota system, and we're going to have a straight number system. And the straight number system was, if you're from India, Mexico, Canada, the Philippines, no matter what it is, you're all going to share the same number. That's equal, not equitable, but it's equal. The biggest problem with immigration, so you've got the global refugee and asylum thing. That has been going on. That is not what we're talking about with immigration. That's what the news is talking about, but that's a United Nations issue. That's what we set up together as a global world to deal with people who are fleeing persecution, religious and political persecution. We happen to have a little bit of a problem with Mexico and South America because that's at our border. Back few years ago, we heard a lot of stories of people coming up from Africa and trying to, the Middle East, and trying to get in, and Spain and Greece and Italy, and just a lot of issues, were going on as the United Nations. I mean, as the European Union was trying to deal with their migration. So migration is happening around the world globally. We have to deal with it as an international community. That is actually not regulated through public policy. Refugee numbers are done by presidential determination. Budgets are given if you want to increase the budget, but refugee and asylum is all executive administration, which is why there's so much drama. Trump and Biden have almost unilateral power to deal with the global migration stuff. They don't have unlimited money, so they have to work with Congress to get more money, but that is a separate conversation. Immigration policy, who can come in our borders outside of global push factors and people fleeing persecution for religious or political reasons, is what we do with this number system. And the biggest problem with our immigration system is that back in 1965, we just decided to assign numbers, 180,000 here, 180,000 there, 180,000 there, with not allowing for any flexibility for agricultural, economic changes, families, the fact that it's cheaper for people in Mexico to petition for their families versus Africa. So all of that immigration policy, the way we do these equal number system, it literally has not changed since 1965. As far as there's no pathway that has been created for people who are here without status. There's no real pathway to, you can't decide one morning, I think I'm going to work on immigrating to the United States. There's just no way, unless you have like $1 million and you want to start a business and hire 10, employees, or if you're like Justin Bieber and you've decided you want to, live in the United States as a Canadian and even break laws. I mean, there's just no way you can come to the United States. There's tourist visas if you can prove that you've got money, but you can't even come and work, even though we desperately need it. So we have a system that is out of date. I don't use a computer or a cell phone since 1965. And I specifically chose that because you didn't have computers or cell phones. Nothing in 2021 is operating effectively if we haven't changed it since 1965. Now in the 80s and in the 90s, especially in 1996, with all the crime, the crime bill that was under the Clinton administration, the most egregious bills happened during that era for immigration. So we've seen a lot of punitive measures to punish people for being here without status, for coming and not having a way to get in. And that's the only kinds of legislation that we've worked on pretty much since 1965. So we don't have the visas that we need for our economy. Now, what happened with we actually don't have nearly as many people coming as we did in the 80s. Another thing that happened in 1965 is they closed the northern and southern borders. So by 1965, now everything, you need permission to come in from everybody. But really what ended up happening was everybody kind of moved past south, from Mexico into the United States. There were some things during the Eisenhower administration, but for the most part, it was a don't look kind of a thing. But when we created the Department of Homeland Security, we put all of that under DHS, probably for some smart reasons. And when Bush created the Department of Homeland Security, he specifically said, now we need to fix immigration, because we made our borders really, really tight. And now people were literally going to be separated from their families. We had been so passive at our borders. Now there was no way anybody could come back and forth from Mexico. And so you look at what's happened since the early 2000s. Of the 11.5 million undocumented people in the United States, almost 10 million, over 85% have been here since then. And it's because there's not a free flow. And so when you're here, you're kind of stuck here and you're never going to go back. And we have almost a net zero. The amount of people who are crossing illegally and being sent back is about zero. And so we don't have this invasion of immigrants coming. We have a huge undocumented population with no way to make it right. And we have no political will and no healthy political landscape. So just general public policy at every level, local, state, federal, if you have a shared defined problem, then you move to create a public policy solution, but no solution will see the light of day if the window isn't open. And the two things that you really need for a successful jumping through that window to get things happen, like immigration or even housing policy and upzoning, whatever it is, city council, state or federal level, you need political will and landscape. And those go together. Politicians have to decide that they're going to do what, like Representative Mike Kaufman did for years at the end of his term. I will stand alone, be the lone voice of the Republicans for sort of supporting comprehensive immigration reform. And I'm going to work with, the Democratic liberals. I mean, he was his own person, even through Trump. So you've got to have somebody who's going to be willing to do that. But Mike Kaufman didn't get what he wanted because he was one person. And you need a landscape. And that's kind of where we are with the citizenry. Back in 2014, when we had the Gang of Eight bill, we had made it through the House, which actually was pretty sticky back then. And when did we start in the Senate? No, we started in the Senate and made it through with a supermajority, and the House was tricky. So now sometimes we forget, we have like Congress amnesia, like the House was always this progressive liberal place. Just a few years ago, we couldn't get things passed. Democrats didn't have the majority and they could shut things down. And the Speaker of the House was just not letting bills get forward. So this Gang of Eight bill, which looked almost the exact same as the 2007 bill that President Bush put up, that his caucus, like Tom Tancredo led the House and spewing hateful stuff about immigrants and, killing that bill. And then, now we have the Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the DREAM Act up in 2010. And the Republicans said you can have one, but not the other. So we had Don't Ask, Don't Tell got removed, but the DREAM Act kind of sat dormant. And then we were moving in 2012-13 with this Gang of Eight bill, this bipartisan thing. And we thought it was going to pass. We had the supermajority in the Senate. It passed with flying colors. We were ready for the House. And then a bunch of things happened politically. I mean, even Sean Hannity, you would have thought Rush Limbaugh, they're all saying this immigration is so great. I have a personal letter from then Representative Gardner saying, we're going to get this done in the spring. I mean, like Republicans were like patting themselves on the back because the landscape was so good. The narrative was so great. And that was April 2014. And then May 2014, everything fell apart. And I'm telling you all of these details, not to get you into the weeds of immigration, but to use as a case study of what happens. So you may not even know the name Eric Cantor. Tea Party primaried him. He was the majority whip in the House. He lost his vote. He lost his seat in the primary. An incumbent that was, with us, he lost his seat. And so that all of a sudden the Republicans are nervous, like the Tea Party is reemerging. We're going to lose our power. We can't run an immigration bill. And even if we could, if you go back to the newspaper, then all of a sudden, for the first time, pretty much ever, a story of 40,000 unaccompanied minors at our border, an invasion of, disease and children. And we can't handle that. Again, that's global policy. That the immigration bill had nothing to do with that, but the narrative destroyed the political landscape. So when you have a landscape that goes kaput, then the political will goes back with it. So I think if we had anybody but Trump, we'd have been fine because we hadn't lost the bills. But then Trump enters a race. July 1st, 2015, I get a newswire. This is before he has said anything. I get a newswire because I get all of these things. And I was working for a national organization whose my president was on a commission with President Obama. I call him and I'm like, I think we have a problem. An undocumented man just killed a woman on a San Francisco pier when she was walking with her dad. This could be a real problem. Now, I was just thinking about for the issue of immigration. I had no clue that Trump was ever going to say anything, do anything. He hadn't done anything. He'd been in the race for 2 weeks. And then he comes out with the most horrible phrase that we still use about how Mexicans are murderers and, you know, the whole line. And then it all explodes. And so now here we are in 2021 trying to convince Republicans who are with us on the DREAM Act to try to be with us at the DREAM Act again, and they're not budging because Trump has created a landscape that's dangerous. So I can say, oh, let's bury our head in the sand, but no, this is the time. If there's ever a time to try to build bridges to Republicans and conservatives, this is the time, because we can create the landscape that, and it was death in 2007, and we, you know, Mike Kaufman was not a good guy as far as the stuff he said when he first took office and took time to create a seat. But, you know, you work to try to do this at not just a singular level, but at a very collective level. I have watched it numerous times change a political landscape, and it's time to do that again. We don't really want. Okay, sorry, that was a lot. That you asked me a hard question.
I just wanted to, Maureen, did you get what you wanted from this? Can you pull out what you needed?
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I know it diverted us a little bit from the topic. So
No,
there's just going to be a quiz on immigration history and policy afterwards.
Well, when you say landscape, could you speak? And I know Nora, you're not forgotten, but Michelle, Michelle, when you say the landscape, change the landscape, what are in 2 seconds? What are you talking about?
You need to make it safe for leaders to vote in your.
How?
Well, you work on, so that's building relations. So that's not a 10-second answer. You have to always have a relationship. Yeah, you have to have a relationship with your leaders at all times. You always, every August recess, you CHUM should be meeting with, you know, your lead. You have to build a relationship, not just in a crisis, but in the calm. You'd have to, because that's when they start to call you and depend on you, because they will ask you, help me through this. Mike Kaufman asked me to do things. I did it for him so that it could make it safer. You build relationships.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, Nora.
Remember to unmute. I think you are. Okay.
Well, I don't know where to start. I'm a bit overwhelmed, actually, and that doesn't, it's okay. It's okay. I first of all want to say congratulations on realizing the importance of loving your enemies. I've just heard that from someone I greatly admire, who's my dear friend, Kathy Kelly, the peace activist. And she defined, 4 of her primary goals that she functions with. And one of them is to love her enemies. And so I think what you said about seeing their humanity is crucial. And if you can see them as a 5-year-old child, start with that. Start with seeing them as a 5-year-old child and go from there. But I also would love to see or know more ways that we can see the humanity of the immigrants who are here without status. These are the people who've been here the 20 years and have never been able to go back to their homes. And what that has done to the society in Mexico, where I spend a lot of time, is unbelievable. You have entire villages throughout the country that have only old people and children and mothers without fathers, families, mothers, single mothers with children, and they haven't seen the fathers in years. Or children who don't know their parents because their grandparents or their aunts or uncles are raising them, and both parents are here. And to give you a notion about this, I just want to say that I was in the Mexican supermarket the other night, and there's a place where they send money home. It's not Western Union, but it's another like Western Union. And I was so moved by the line of workers, possibly 12 of them, lined up in their work clothes, construction workers, roofers, whatever, lined up, waiting to be able to come forward to the desk and send money home. And I walked through the market thinking about this, and I couldn't help but talk to the cashier about it. I said, I noticed all these men there. And you know what she said to me? She said, yes, we have that all the time. And she said, the thing is that many times the families in Mexico don't appreciate it. They think the money grows on trees here, and if they're here, it's just raining down on them, and they don't know what they go through to earn that money. And I personally know, having started a wage claims clinic at the Centro Humanitario Center here in Denver for mostly undocumented workers. By the way, if you want a worker, it's on Park Avenue West and California, Centro Humanitario. And you want a good worker, you call them. They are amazing. But there were people taking these men out to work, and women, taking them out to work and then not paying them. And when it first started, I started a wage claims clinic, and then the University of Denver Law School took it over. And as far as I know, it's still going, although the center has been closed during COVID. Okay. So yesterday I was on an immigration Zoom with the network lobby group, Sister Simone Campbell's group. And I want this last part of my deal here is I want to know from you why Biden is still holding on to Title 42, which, I mean, at least he opened that up because Trump had closed it. But Title 42 is now, under Title 42, people who come to the border, apparently, if they're families with small children under 10, can get in. And secondly, unaccompanied minors can get in. And thirdly, vulnerable populations, which are like people from Haiti, who had no grounds to come in under otherwise, are being let in. But they still have to go through the asylum process, but they're being let in. Now, what the lobby group, network lobby group, was asking for us to sign on to action that would ask Biden to reinstate asylum. Okay? The problem with asylum is exactly what you've said. You have to have specific grounds for seeking asylum: political, gender, religion, violence. Violence under Jeff Sessions was not even allowed. So, okay. So is that what we want at this point, is to reinstate asylum? Because that still doesn't give, for example, Mexicans cannot seek political asylum.
Right.
So that leaves all of them out.
Yeah.
What is it we want to push for that's clear and directed and focused, and that we as the moral conscience can fight for?
Yeah.
And you and Jennifer Piper and Kathy Kelly, and God love you, because, and I'm sure she does. So keep on keeping on. We'll help you. Tell us how. Thank
Okay.
you.
I love it, Nora. No, I am in some ways, I'm sorry that I answered Maureen's question with those weeds, but like I said, I'm trying to give big stories for case studies, because there are things like when Deanna asked, what's a political landscape? If I just like put a slide up there and said, you need this, this, and this, you guys are sleepy. And that's just how students are naturally, or people who are listening. So I'm hoping you'll remember parts of the story, not because I'm trying to turn everybody into an immigration activist like me, although I'd love to have you. But just for us to understand that some of us see and work more specifically on certain injustices than others, not because we don't care about everything, but we are human beings with only so much capacity. And so one of the things we don't want to do is just shut down and say, well, it's just too big and I just don't care. I'm just going to, not even try on anything. And so I'm not saying that anybody in this room is feeling that way, but I'm trying to just at least let us all know, because I have to remind myself, I don't want to look away. So you're right. I want to love my neighbor and I want to love my enemies, but I want to make sure I don't look away either. Even if I can't add any human capital to it, that doesn't mean I don't want to look away. For me, because I have a faith in a God that is very big and that he sees, that's just my grief that I can put back to him and say, what are you doing? Like, please, have mercy on us and keep working. So I hate that I'm kind of getting in the weeds of immigration, but I just want to say, for those of you who might like, this is something you should just think of it as a case study, friends, and just know that we're just drilling down into one, and we can talk about other things as
And
well.
I just want you to know, Michelle, this is just fine. I mean, you grabbed onto something and it's very informative, and I think we're very interested in it.
Okay.
We may just have to have you back again.
Well, I'm happy to do, I'm happy to do what I'm doing for Rotary, and I can bring some friends. And Nora, you asked a question, how come we can't see, the immigrants? And I think that is a part of shifting the political landscape. People are trying to tell the story, but there's so much competing for our attention. That's why people like me build national campaigns to help direct. So I know Sister Simone Campbell. I know Sister Norma Pimentel down at the Rio Grande Valley. I've been there so many times, and she and I have spoken on panels together. I mean, like, she is a saint, and amazing. I mean, Sister Simone is fantastic, badass, so they make up different spaces within the sisterhood of the Catholic Church, and they're both champions for justice, and so grateful. But there are ways that we can try to get more visibility on stories, and some of it is just by our own sharing. So we see things, and I don't mean sharing on social media, that's fine, but Facebook isn't worthy really of this good content, right? And so how do we continue to really get the stories that you are seeing, that I am seeing? And sometimes I've done things like, I remember I planned a 150-mile walk from Tijuana into LA with 150 national leaders on immigration. We had blisters and we had no heat stroke, but I mean, it was a grueling, time. And we did it in such a way that we got 83 media hits. We're on major national news. We were a global Snapchat story. I mean, there's actual ways but you can't do it every day at the same level. And so there's times when you realize the stories, whether we see them or not, the injustice that happens, whether we know about it or not, is always going on. And so there's times that we say, we're going to set apart this season, things like June is Immigrant Heritage Month. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we center the stories of our immigrant heritage, that we center the story of World Women's Day. And those are not small trite things. And sometimes there's just an urgency, you go drop everything and make sure you put your attention to it. So I think the stories are there. It's just a question of how are we doing a good job of using our platforms to elevate them. And when we collaborate, we're able to do it a little bit better. So I'm going to drop something in the chat. It's called Faith in Action's Fast for Freedom. So I think you probably know about the PICO network. We had it together, Colorado. It used to be MOP. Okay, so the PICO network changed to Faith in Action. Same exact organization, actually having a call with their deputy director, the second in command, in another hour. And he and I are going to be working on the Truth, Reconciliation, Healing Commission grassroots campaign that we're getting funding for, so we can really, do a lot around the injustice of race and the assault on critical race theory, et cetera. But right now, with immigration, there is a very collaborative national effort. And when I say national, I don't mean just national people. I mean groundswell of local people. So CHUM should find out what's Fast for Freedom. How can we join? And it's very generic. It's not for Christians or Catholics or Jewish people or people Muslim. It's this idea that we are withholding in a practice so that we can show the serious nature of our desire for freedom. Fast for Families was something SEIU started back a few years ago, and it was on this tent I was in the tent with ASC Eliseo Medina and Sister Pimon Sister Pimentel and Sister Simone was there, and President Obama, Joe Biden. It just seemed like everybody was coming to the tent. But so that they didn't know that when they pitched a tent that it would create this groundswell. So I think the power of story is important. The ability for our story on immigration to always, rule the day is unrealistic. But there are times and seasons that the political likelihood, like you don't ever want to do anything July 1st and 15th. Well, I shouldn't even say that. You don't do things before Christmas. Everyone's going home. Like, don't make that your big push. Wait till January when everybody comes back up. It's like you have to be strategic on when you're going to elevate stuff. And right now, Fast for Freedom is happening around immigration. It's around the legalization of dreamers, of TPS recipients. I won't get into the weeds on that. And then essential workers. A lot of our essential workforce is undocumented. They got us through the pandemic. We should really afford them an opportunity to come out from the shadows and, not just contribute their work, but their whole person and be able to work towards legalization and the path to citizenship. So that is that campaign right now, pushing for that and trying at every level to get a groundswell. And it is going to work because Biden hadn't done anything. And now Kamala has visited the border and there's some conversation. So there's a part of me as an activist that wants to just constantly push into Biden hasn't done this. And he hasn't. There's a lot of things that he hasn't done. But I also know from the last 4 years, so much was undone. And they have to repair and restore. So Title 42, the fact that we don't have comprehensive immigration reform from Congress is staggering. But I told you, where it comes to asylums and refugee, the president has so much authority. Attorney General Sessions was, I almost don't want to call him that. I really struggle with that man. Working on Love My Enemies. Anyway, he just kept changing all of these rules. And we could say, oh, we'll just change it back. Biden has done an insane amount of executive orders and he's taking a lot of hits for it. And so, yeah, it seems like, this is my issue. I want him to do it today. I wanted him to do it last week. I don't know why he's not. I was, interacting with Melissa Rogers, who runs the Faith and, Council. I even offered, I say, hey, do you want me to move to DC? Do you need my help? I was about that desperate. And so I don't know why they aren't, but I do know the groundswell is making it more painful. And events like you were on with Sister Simone helped get Joe Biden elected. Catholics needed, she helped. So did Sister Norma Pimentel. I was on some of those. I was on an advisory council for Biden's election that I met every week, and it was around faith. And people put up a lot to stand for him, and they're basically calling him in for the favors. And so the immigrant rights community, but specifically the faith leaders, not going to roll over and play dead. It's happening, but it makes it easier when it's not Sister Simone standing by herself, but everybody's signing on, and whole congregations and pastors and, things that we're doing locally that we can have in the news and CPR and the Denver Post and even in small little papers around the metro area to say, hey, yeah, we're with you. Because I have learned this about politicians. They are not leaders. It's really disgusting and hard. And we just have to just kind of swallow hard, just realize they are not leaders. We are the leaders in our community. Politicians are waiters, WAITERS. They are waiting for safety to stand for something. We cannot continue to wait for them to lead on these issues. We have to keep pushing. And this is the hard work of justice. And I will say this, immigration didn't start when I walked into the movement. Black Lives Matter didn't start when we all bought a t-shirt and walked. We are joining movements that have been going on for hundreds. And we could the streams of injustice go back from the beginning of time. And so we come in and we stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us. We carry the water a little bit farther up the hill, and we don't quit until we have allowed other people to stand on our shoulders. And that is the long work of justice. And we have to realize it's not flash pan, and we lose a lot. And I wrote a lot about this in my book. I put my link to my book. If you really want to get to the head of an evangelical, I'd spent first 4 chapters deconstructing white conservative evangelicalism so that by chapter 5, maybe everybody could hear me. But I will say, I remember during, after Eric Gardner was murdered and Black Lives Matter was really getting going, it was one of those times I was never sleeping because all I was doing was working. And I remember our COO called me, and he and I were just sort of sitting there in silence because another person had been murdered, and there was a video, and what were we going to do? And, as far as a national response. And then we had this big period of silence, and he said, Michelle, how can you do this every single day and not quit? All you do is lose. Now, I didn't work for an advocacy organization. I was the advocacy director. So he was doing other good work, and, he wasn't all that big of a fan of advocacy. So he asked me that. And I said, you know what, Dave, the reality is that I have to be a person of hope. Hope is not dealing with reality. It's a setting a vision of what can be. And I said, so every day I have to make the decision to drink a glass of hope. Some days I am choking it down. It's a chosen decision to believe not in what I see. I do not have rose-colored glasses. I do not think it's all going to work out just fine. I keep in mind, I used to. That's 20 years ago. I have to choose to set a vision and drink a big glass of hope. I said, some days that glass is enormous. And I think that's where we're at, is it's just a hard, long work. Now, I don't say that in martyrdom, and I actually believe in the work that I'm doing and the work that we all are doing for justice, but I at least want to identify the exhaustion, but we don't have any other choice.
Michelle, I wanted to just say something here quickly. Yesterday in this immigration webinar, we learned that the children who were originally separated from their families, the question was asked, what's happened to those children? And a lot of people are asking that question. And what we found what the answer that was given was that 2,500 of 12,000 children have been reunited with their families. That means 9,500 children have been placed in foster homes. So in case you're wondering what happened to all those children, that's what's happened, according to the report yesterday.
No, it's disgusting, Nora, and it's just a big bummer. The more you learn about it, it's going to take us decades to undo the harm of the last 4 years.
There's a very good article in the New Yorker, August 20th issue, I believe it is, Stephen Miller and his role in concocting that theme of the unaccompanied children. So if you're interested, that's where you can find the lowdown. But think of it, 10,000 children, or 9,500 children in foster homes, never knowing where their parents are, because there was no kind of order in that. Is that your read on that?
Yeah. Oh, no, that's exactly right. You're exactly right. I'll just say, I know we're supposed to end here in a minute. Let me tell you, the hand that is writing our history is telling a very true and desperately sad story. And it is really up to us to force the hand that's writing it, because I will say that history will not remember us well.
So,
okay, sorry, I made you all miserable, and that was not my plan.
I feel like we just started. So here's what I need people to do is take a deep breath right now and take in the hope. It's like a drink of water. Pretend you have a tall glass of water that's filled with possibility and hope. And take it in right now before we sign off. And in gratitude of the work that everyone has done, and gratitude for you, Michelle, that you keep drinking the water and help us to remember to do that, because it's a very difficult thing to do. There's so much more to say. There's so much more for us to talk about. With that glass of water, I also want to, if you can put this up, Sonia, and I want to thank you, Sonia, for putting all the connections. That's so helpful for people, since we can't look at it now and we want to go back. This will be on our CHUM website. So Sonia will be putting it on there. And there was an editorial by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times a couple days ago. And the title is, Want to Change Minds? Listen. And it's very difficult, but it talks about a gentleman, Daryl Davis, who's a Black musician, and he hangs out with the Ku Klux Klan, and he has changed lives. He has supposedly a closet filled with Ku Klux Klan outfits of people who have left because of him willing to listen. And there is also, he has a, I'm just looking for it here, he has a TED Talk about what he does, and he has a number of books that he's written on it. So I encourage you to look that up, and thank you, Sonia. And also, I just think we need to figure out a way to have not only these conversations that give us hope and give us a charge to keep doing the work, because we get tired. I do, and I get angry, and I don't know what else to do at times. I think the thing for immigration for me was when they were deciding that it was okay for children to be taken away from their parents, and we watched that happen live on the news. I walked over to Gardner's office. I walked over to Bennett's office, and I said to Gardner's office, he wasn't there, or he was, but whatever. And I said, I will probably never vote for you, but you are supposedly a man of faith. And how you can be that and not stand up and scream right now. And you said it, Michelle, they're not leaders. The leaders right now should be screaming on so many issues. Look what's happening in climate. Look what's happening in all kinds of things. And I said, into the Bennett's office, I said, most likely I will vote for you. However, you need to be screaming. I'm glad you want to bring people together. This is not a time to bring people together. This is a time to scream and change what's happening at the border. So, guys, thank you for being here. Michelle, thank you. And we have to remember to just keeping drinks of hope during the day. Maybe label a glass. I'm being serious. Label a glass, because we won't remember otherwise. Thank you, Beth. Peace to you all. And Michelle, I'd like you to come on again.
Thank you, Michelle.